What's going on, guys? It is Tyson the Trainer, back with another Sports Talk video. Today we're going to be talking about fuel sources. Now, I've covered a little bit in a few other episodes ago, but I want to kind of make this own standing thing so you can understand how fuel is used, the fuel sources we have, how they're used in our everyday life, and kind of how we can make sure we're doing the best we can in regards to our fuel sources, right? So basically, we have two predominant fuel sources. We have fat and we have carbohydrate, okay? So, there's a few things that are going to dictate how we use either fat as a fuel source or carbohydrate as a fuel source, all right? One is the food we eat. So, if you are someone who's eating primarily more higher fat food, you will use fat as a fuel source because that's the only amount of energy coming in, and the body's going to have to get good at using that fat as a fuel source, right? A perfect example, people who do keto, using very high fat diet, they talk about burning fat. And it's like, yes, you do burn fat, but you're burning fat as your fuel source first. So all the food you're eating will be used as a fuel source before we start to use adipose tissue or intramuscular triglycerides, which is just fat in our muscles. We will not use them until our fat from the fuel, our fat from our food has been utilized. All right. So always the food that's going to come in first is going to be utilized for just overall fuel. Okay. If you're having higher primarily carbohydrates and a lower fat intake, that's actually going to be a bit of an issue because it's going to be causing you to be metabolically inflexible, because we use fat as a fuel source at lower intensities too. So when I'm sitting around and I'm doing nothing, or I'm walking during the day just doing my steps, I'm using primarily fat as a fuel source, okay? Because my heart rate is low. And if I'm doing this and I'm having a high carbohydrate intake, it's teaching the body to bring in carbohydrates. Now it's got to go through a certain mechanism to be able to turn that into fat, right? So carbohydrates can be turned into fat, but it's harder to turn carbohydrates into fat than it is for fat to turn into fat, because fat doesn't need to do anything, it just goes straight into the body, okay? So we have to try and break down the carbohydrates, turn them into fat, then use that either as a fuel source, ideally, or we store it as body fat, okay? On the other hand, if you're having fat as your main calorie intake, and your main energy source or calorie intake, and then we're just walking, sitting around, doing stuff during the day, doing not a lot of high intensity things, then you'll be efficient at using fat as a fuel source, because the exercises or the things you're doing just require fat, right? You don't require carbohydrates unless it starts to become like more muscle contracting. So when I'm doing weight training, it's going to require carbohydrates and fats because you've got a higher heart rate, then your heart rate comes back down. So when you're contracting muscle, you are using muscle glycogen, but then when we're not contracting muscle, when we're resting a little bit, chilling out, we're also using fat as a fuel source. So weight training is up and down. Same as a lot of things, things that are going to be primarily, one fuel source for the most part is basically going to be on your intensity, okay? So if you're a runner, I talked about this last time. If you're a runner, you wake up in the morning, you don't have anything to eat, you go for a run and it's under 65, or if you're a professional runner, it's under 75% of your heart rate max, you're going to be using fat primarily as a fuel source, okay? Which means you have plenty of fat storage to be able to use. You have intramuscular triglycerides, I can't even say that word. You have adipose tissue that's going to be used as fat as a fuel source. So you have all these things that are going to be used as a fuel source first, okay? And despite contracting muscle, your heart rate isn't that high to be able to require carbohydrates. You still will use a little bit of carbohydrates during your training if it's low intensity stuff, because we're never going to be predominantly just fat or just carbohydrates unless we push up to really high amounts. So again, if you're sitting between that under 65 or even that 75, you can have a mixture of carbohydrates and fats, but fats for the most part. So you'll burn through a little bit of muscle glycogen, but not a lot. However, if you went above 75% of your heart rate max, then you're going to be primarily using carbohydrates as your fuel source, right? This is why we want to make sure, based on what we're going to be doing, eating beforehand if it's going to be something more intense, because we want to make sure we have enough glycogen in our muscles. We want to make sure we have glycogen in our liver, and we want to make sure we have glucose in the blood, which you're always going to have no matter what. But we're going to use that food as a fuel source. Like I said, if you eat high fat, you're going to use fat as a fuel source first. If you eat high carbohydrates, you're going to use carbohydrates as a fuel source first. So again, when it comes to these intense type of training sessions, contracting muscle, pushing yourself hard, that's when you're going to want to have carbohydrates as your fuel source. Hopefully that's making sense. So I'll give you guys an example. If I'm going to go and do a weight training session today and I eat beforehand, I'm going to make sure that meal has carbohydrates and fats in it, because I'm going to be using both of those in a workout. But if I was going to go do sprints in the park this afternoon, I want to make sure I just have carbohydrates in my day leading up to that, carbohydrates for breakfast, carbohydrates for my lunch, carbohydrates for afternoon snack. That way my muscle glycogen is going to be fully saturated in order to be able to go and do those sprints and produce the best. Because what we know from research is that having full muscle glycogen is going to help perform the best you can. Okay? So in the last video, I talked about, there are times where you want to train low and have lower carbohydrates and train at like a lower intensity stuff to use fat as a fuel source. Then when we do our high intensity stuff, we use carbohydrates as our fuel source. Very important between these two factors. But in saying that, the intensity is still going to matter, no matter, like the intensity is still going to dictate the amount of kind of what you're using as fat or carbohydrates as a fuel source, right? In saying that, if you are someone who's just weight training and being quite sedentary, the ratio to carbohydrates and fat isn't going to matter that much. But as long as you're having a mixture of both of those in your diet, because if you're doing your steps and then doing weight training, you will be using carbohydrates and fat as a fuel source throughout the day, and you'll be alternating between both of them. And this is also why it's important to make sure we do have both predominantly fat and carbohydrates in our, like, we want to have a mixture of both, because we want to be metabolically flexible. We want to be able to use carbohydrate when we need them, and then in the meantime, we're going to be able to switch back to fats, okay? And also, like, this is why cardiovascular health is so important, because the better you can get at cardiovascular exercise, and the more you can kind of push that heart rate up and use fat as a fuel source, the more metabolically flexible you're going to be, which means you can handle nutrients better, which means your body knows how to use fat as a fuel source and use carbohydrate as a fuel source and not become insulin resistant or other things that could be happening too. So exercise is such an important thing in regards to all this, and just kind of delineating between those two. So again, if you are someone who's going to be doing boxing, go for swimming, do anything that's going to be consistent, and your heart rate's going to be up and down, for the most part, you're probably going to be entering that above that 65% of your heart rate max, and you want to make sure you're having carbohydrates before your workout or during your workout to fuel that intensity. If you're doing an hour of boxing, you're going to be depleting a fair bit of glycogen, especially in your arms. So sipping on Powerade during your training, not just for electrolytes, which is also important, but making sure you're getting the carbohydrates back into the body so you can be drinking, sipping, having an immediate source of glucose to be able to use and to keep yourself kind of like on point. And what they've actually found is, the lower your glycogen goes down, the harder it is for your brain to actually keep firing at its best, and which is why we want to have carbohydrates during our intense workouts, right? Now here's something just to take into consideration. We talk about fat as a fuel source, low intensity stuff, under 65% for the most part, and we talk about carbohydrates as our fuel source. This does not mean, though, that if we're burning carbohydrates, we're not going to lose body fat. All right? If you're someone who's if you're an athlete and you're trying to lose weight, doesn't matter what heart rate zone you train in or how intense your training is, because overall, calories are the most important. Okay? If you've gone and done a if you've gone and done a real hard run, you're running at 80% of your heart rate max. You're running that for an hour. You've done a real solid. What's that? If I was to say an hour. Let's say an hour and a half, and you've done 20 Ks, okay? Is that right? Yeah, about an hour and a half, 20 Ks, okay? You've absolutely fucking smashed it. You've kept your heart rate high. You've just absolutely you just nailed it. I can't even say what I'm going to say. You've got that done, okay? You finish, you're like, phew, I am absolutely fucked. You check your heart rate, you're like, yeah, it's 180 reps, 180 beats per minute. It tells you what your calorie burn. Let's say you burned 1,200 calories, all right? You burned 1,200 calories in 90 minutes. Cool. So you burn 1,200 calories, but you're like, oh, it's all from carbohydrates. That means I'm not going to lose any body fat. Absolutely not. Absolutely not that you think that. So you're definitely going to lose body fat regardless, because what you've just done is, even though that's high intensity, you burnt all carbohydrates. So you burnt a lot of muscle glycogen, okay? Even though you burnt a lot of muscle glycogen during that time, now that you don't have any muscle glycogen and you've done that exercise, what are you going to do for the rest of the day? Well, you're going to refill your muscle glycogen first, but if you're still staying in your calories overall that are lower, your body is going to be needing a fuel source from that fat deposit, because now you're not doing high intensity stuff all the time. You can't do high intensity stuff all the time, so you go back into fat burning mode. Use fat as your fuel source. So then adipose tissue starts to become broken down, and then you start to use fat as your fuel source, and that is actually how you lose body fat. And guess what? You lose body fat by actually breathing it out. That's exactly how you lose it. You don't pee it out, you shit out a little bit. But for the most part, it is actually coming out of breathing. And that's why, they say, when you do high intensity exercise, and they talk about the excess post oxygen consumption, that burns all those extra calories. It doesn't really, but because now you're in an oxygen deficit and you're going to be breathing a little bit harder, and the heart rate might be sitting a little bit higher. And so you will burn calories after that high intensity training session, but not nearly as many as you think, okay? But in saying that, again, if I just went and burned 1,600 calories on a fucking cardio or whatever it's going to be, and then I then I sit around, do a little bit more steps. Let's say I do 1,600 calories on cardio, I still do another 10,000 steps in the day, right? So I've burnt a shitload amount of energy. I'm still on a calorie deficit. Even though you've eaten all that food back, you've restored muscle glycogen, which is going to happen because you're getting those carbohydrates back in, but you're definitely still going to be losing body fat. Because again, you're not bringing in enough energy to be able to make up that deficit, and the body's going to use fat as a fuel source because you're at that low intensity state, you know? Just think, you're burning fat when you're sleeping, you're burning fat when you're sitting down, you're burning fat when you're just not doing anything, basically, because that is going to be the main fuel source. Just because that's how our body works, right? So we do have fats, we do have carbohydrates as our fuel source. We do want to be able to alternate between both of them, so having times of high intensity training, having times of low intensity training. Our food, while we eat, is also going to predominantly choose what we're going to be using as a fuel source. So even if you eat a big carbohydrate meal, and we go for a low intensity run, we're actually going to be using a little bit more of those carbohydrates versus fat because we've got them broken down in our system. The body's going to use them for immediate energy. Same thing, if you have a high fat diet and then you try and do something high intensity, it's going to be a little bit more tricky now. So you're still going to use a majority of carbohydrates as your fuel source as opposed to fat, but you'll be able to push the intensity a little bit higher to use fat as that fuel source. However, you actually won't be able to push yourself as hard if it was just all fat, you know? And this is also why ketogenesis, if you go into a keto diet, you're predominantly eating more fat, right? People say, I'm eating keto, I'm burning fat as a fuel source. Yes, you definitely are burning fat as a fuel source, but you're burning the fat that you're eating first as opposed to adipose tissue. So it doesn't matter if you're on keto or you're on a normal diet, a calorie deficit is a calorie deficit. If you're on keto and you're eating the same amount of food, you ain't gonna lose body fat. You're gonna use fat from all the food you're eating versus body fat. If you're in a keto and you're a deficit, you'll lose body fat. If you're on a normal diet and you deficit, you'll lose body fat. That's the thermodynamics rule, right? So in saying that, if you did keto and you did a high fat diet, low carbohydrate diet, you actually won't be able to push your intensity as hard because once you don't have your muscle glycogen saturated or full, you are not going to be able to contract muscle as well. And this is why people can't push themselves as hard or as intense on a ketogenic diet, because the principles of just how the body uses energy and what's actually needed for intensity, which is carbohydrates, can no longer be used because you don't have carbohydrates. So that's a really important thing for athletes. Like, do not do the keto diet. Do these low carbohydrate diets because you are an athlete and are going to need carbohydrates. Cool. So that's the video today. I hope that makes sense. I hope it all cleared up. If you guys have any questions, as always, go to Instagram, message me at Tyson the Trainer with 2 R's. And until next time, guys, speak to you then.